Everyone has a favorite Disney movie, even if you think you don't like Disney. They hold rights to everything from The Princesses to National Treasure to even Treasure Island. With so many strong titles under their belt, it's surprising only in the last few decades that they've begun to stray from the age-old rules and standards set forward by the fairy tales they very, very loosely base these movies on. Themes in the early Disney movies were generally pretty simple. If you're hot, you're good. If you look like you've been beaten with an ugly stick, you're bad, and good always triumphs over evil. Always. There are just some rules that evidently you don't mess with, like the prince always getting the princess, orphans are apparently more relatable, and no one's hair will ever get messed up. Seriously, you just fought your way through a briar patch and killed a dragon, and not a single hair is out of place. How is that a thing? It wasn't until the 60s that a few subtle hints of real-world problems began to sneak their way into the beloved films of Disney. One of the more notable ones being The Parent Trap in 1961, no, not the one with Lindsay Lohan, where two identical sisters trick their divorced parents into falling in love again through a rather well-thought-out and quite convoluted plan. Divorce is a pretty heavy subject for children, and the movie handled it by giving them the solution of the parents getting back together in the end, probably crushing children everywhere when they tried to pull the same crap on their folks and failed miserably. Then in December of 1970, the Aristocats was released. A butler tries to get rid of a bunch of cats to gain financial stability, but luckily for us, the cats saved the day and defeated the butler, which is not only completely unrealistic, but panders entirely to the rules of Disney. Good must triumph. But nowadays, Disney has gone in an entirely new direction with slipping these sort of messages and life lessons in their movies. Films like Zootopia and Big Hero 6 are so laden with way more mature and nuanced themes than previously seen from the Bubblegum and Balloons company. Zootopia's focus is pretty explicitly about casual, ingrained, and social norm-style racism. It's incredibly well done, especially since the kids brushed it over, while their parents sat stricken at the familiar scenes unfolding before them in HD. In Big Hero 6, Disney did a phenomenal job depicting the grief process. After Tadashi dies, we see Hiro go through withdrawal from his friends and family, stop eating, and just generally neglect his own health. He gets frustrated, he gets blinded by his anger, and he actually has a moderate breakdown in the garage with Baymax. Usually when a character dies in a Disney film, they skip over the actual grief process straight into the action, but here we actually got to see the majority of the process, from depression to the inevitable rage, and finally accepting that Tadashi is gone and finding a way to come to terms with it. It stands to reason that since most early Disney movies were based at least loosely on fairy tales, villains would be pretty much flat and one-dimensional. Bad guys are usually evil just because it's in their nature to be so, from Queen Grimhild and Snow White wanting to be the prettiest in the world, to Gaston being an over-exaggeration of what the manly stereotypes were back in the day. In the last decade or so, however, the antagonist of Disney had become incredibly multi-dimensional. The greatest example of this is Mother Gothel from Tangled, released in November of 2010. Despite being from a fairy tale, she is debatably one of the darkest villains to ever be put on a screen, especially in a children's movie. Gothel's character pretty much boils down to being an emotionally abusive and manipulative mother figure. She uses passive aggressiveness to undermine and belittle Rapunzel to keep her weak and dependent, to the point that when anything goes wrong, she runs back into her arms just as she's been trained to do. Despite this, she doesn't seem to want to outright kill her semi-adopted daughter like most villains. She just wants to stay young and beautiful forever. Gothel in particular is so much more complex than the earlier days of Disney, and it's both extraordinary and frightening what they managed to accomplish in such an evil force. The last point is hard to criticize too roughly, taking into consideration that this is just how stories were told in the old days. Princes married princesses, every little girl had to have a love interest. Unfortunately, for most of these tales, from Snow White and Aurora laying completely immobilized while the guy saves the day, to Cinderella totally helpless at the hands of her stepmother and dependent on him coming to save her, making the guys the actual heroes of the story. Today's Disney films have veered away from this with startling vigor. Recently released Moana doesn't have a love interest at all. The movie's about a young woman learning where she fits in the world, and romantic bull honky would have just gotten in the way. Frozen completely turned the trope on its head by making the love interest be the villain of the movie. And despite Kristoff wanting to get all up in her Jimmy jams, it's not really a huge deal, with the primary struggle being Anna and her sister. Zootopia is another debatable point on whether Judy or Nick count as a romantic couple, but despite whether they end up lovey-dovey or just friends, it has nothing to do with the storyline and is in fact Judy's quick thinking that ends up saving the day in the city. Disney's come a long way from damsels in distress, hiding in tall towers, and waiting for a prince to save you. Movies the company produces nowadays are more in tune to what we as an audience can connect to, with deep, complex villains, people experiencing grief in a realistic way, and goals that reach a lot further than just marrying royalty and living happily ever after. Hopefully they can keep up the great work with all the upcoming releases of Toy Story 4, Mary Poppins Returns, and the one we're all really waiting for, The Incredibles 2. Wait, even in the newer... How? You literally just fell 200 feet off a damn cliff! Not one strand is out of place! What is this? I don't understand. Disney? Anyone?